So welcome one and all to this very special guest webinar, exploring the art and science of transformation, bridging inner and outer work in our troubled times with Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this session, Marilyn. It's good to see you. So my name is Dr. Jessica Bockler, and I'm one of the co-founding directors of the Aleph Trust. And a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Marilyn Schlitz today into this session. And in terms of the proceedings today, I'm going to give a short introduction to Marilyn and her work. And then Marilyn can take things away from there. And after the presentation, there'll be opportunity for questions and for dialogue as well. So it's a real pleasure for me, actually, to welcome Marilyn to this special webinar. Marilyn is a social anthropologist, a teacher, an author, and she is President Emeritus at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, as well as a professor at Sofia University and a visiting scholar at the University of California in San Diego. And Marilyn has really published many books and scholarly articles, including one with which many of us are very familiar, the book Living Deeply, The Art and Science of Transformation in Everyday Life. And of course, that's a book that is on the reading list of our master's module, Learning Through Integrative Practice. So many of our students and alumni are very familiar with that work, Marilyn. Marilyn's work is pioneering in so many areas, consciousness studies, healing, medicine, and transformation and transformative practice. And more recently, she authored the book called Death Makes Life Possible, as well as being involved in the making of a film that was produced exploring the mysteries of life and death from a variety of perspectives and through a number of worldviews or kind of world traditions, the lenses of world traditions. And this film featured many leading scientists, anthropologists, philosophers alongside Marilyn, including Deepak Chopra, Stuart Hamroff, Lauren Atras, Dean Radin, Rupert Sheldrake, you name them. A wonderful film. And I'm also very excited to say that from February next year, Marilyn will be offering a year-long certificate course at Aleph Trust, which focuses in some of these areas. And that program is called the Grateful Aging Program, Awakening to Our Third Act. And it's a program that really aims to attend to the needs of our elder generation and shift the worldview that's very predominant right now on aging, framing aging, with fear and anxiety about decline and death, and reframing that towards one of hope and possibility, remembering our elders as wisdom keepers. So there are many threads to explore, but this evening we're focusing into the art and science of transformation, and we're really focusing into building bridges between inner work and outer work in times such as these, which are troubled and really calling out for change on individual and collective levels. So Marilyn, it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here with all of you as we move toward the holiday season. And it's a very different one this year than some that we're used to. So I think that the opportunities that we have to use Zoom and these different kinds of social media are really a gift. And I don't think we understood how important they were going to be in our lives until this is how we reach out and connect with one another. So I'm grateful and happy to be here. So I will just share screen and hope that works. Did that work? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to turn that off and just let me know if this is not working. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Hasn't loaded yet. No, it's not showing for us yet.
Okay. It should just come right up. Let's see. Okay, I'm going back to you and share screen, desktop, maybe this one. share. Okay. How about now?
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
great.
That's good.
Great. Okay, so now I want to start from the beginning. There we are. Okay.
Super.
So, my favorite metaphor of transformation is the butterfly, and I have had both the privilege and the challenge of trying to raise butterflies, monarchs, and it had been a really great experience until this past year. And then, I started with some little caterpillars, and one by one they all died. It was so sad. And it was very interesting to watch their process because they kind of pile on top of one another in that process of moving to a different phase. And then the same thing, I started with eggs and they didn't work. So I have moved in the past year since the last time I tried. And I think that, there's just so many aspects of our situation that can impact how transformation occurs, and both the opportunities and the challenges of that. So I love this slide. I think it's really indicative of our times, and so many of us are trying to juggle so many things, whether it's snail mail or voicemail or email or, all the different, Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and, whatever it is. And then with children, trying to manage, how we get them from place to place, if we get them from place to place, given the circumstances, people going out for jobs, trying to manage their houses and trying to manage their lives. It's a very complicated time to be alive. And I think that, all of us are feeling it. I think everybody is, understanding that sense of anxiety. And at the same time, as I said about Zoom and our ability to connect, it's also a time of opportunity. So that's really what I want to say, is that, we can find the beauty even in the midst of the chaos, and really having this opportunity to share with each other what gives us meaning and purpose. This is a fun little cartoon. Remember when everything used to be nice and solid? And it isn't anymore. I mean, we have been forced in very fundamental ways to revise our sense of self, our worldview about what's possible, how we manage with each other. I think that, many of us have found the path to being monks. We're living often in a kind of isolation. We're not going out in the ways we used to. We're not being social in a way that, is part of our base needs. We have, as we recall from our work with Maslow, this kind of hierarchy of needs. And at the fundamental level, our need for conviviality, our need for connection. And, from that, then these higher levels from, the idea of ultimately transformation and maybe even transcendence. How do we transcend our sense of ego? How do we begin to make sense of something that we've never experienced before? So let's see, here we go, down here. So I want to think about 3 guiding questions. And the first is, how do we manage all this uncertainty? How do we find that place of resilience within us? What are the skills and capacities that are needed for life during a pandemic or life during any type of major upheaval? How do we find those resources that are going to help us? And ultimately, how do we move from just coping with all these challenges to flourishing in the midst of it? And these aren't easy things to do. So there is kind of a process of transformation that, if you've read the book Living Deeply, I'm going to kind of overview a little bit about what we found in the process, both before we created that book and after, and then dive into some specific practices, some tools for each of us. So I've set up 5 practices that we can do together that will help to sharpen and refine and polish our inner work, and then help us to begin to speak to how that takes us into the world in ways that are dynamic. So, being a natural scientist, observing what happens as a result of nature's impact on the world. How do we see transformation? What are the elements or the milestones that we can observe in the context of transformation? How do we move from, this idea of simply taking in new information, maybe resisting it, to modifying our own perspective and our own sense of self and others? How do we begin to describe that process, like the natural scientist, like Darwin, who was observing evolution, bit by bit, discovering what are some of these details and how can we understand? How do we then generate hypotheses that will help us to test these, not only as scientists, but in our lives as natural scientists, applying these principles to everyday experience? Another cartoon, really, I'm fine. It was just a fleeting sense of purpose. I'm sure it will pass. So this deep dive that we have for understanding what gives us meaning, how do we calibrate what's important to us when things are changing so rapidly, when things we took for granted are no longer there to be predictable? How is it that we can begin to observe as a natural scientist where are those sources of meaning? And how is it that we can find our way in relationship to others so that we don't have to be covering up this sense of purpose? We can begin to thrive through our sense of destiny, through our sense of commitment to understanding the higher levels of our human calling and our human potentials. So consciousness has been a topic that I have been fascinated with since, I was in my undergrad days, and really trying to look at, what was the nature of the world we live in. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. It was at a time when there was huge chaos. It was, the 60s and 70s when we were confronting, very much like we are today, issues of race and gender and ethnicity and power politics. And as a kid, I felt angry. I felt challenged. I wanted to make a difference in the world, but I was an impotent teenager. And so often what happened for me was that, it led to aberrant behaviors. I acted out, just like many people act out, because we don't know what else to do with these feelings and these emotions. So it wasn't really until I got into college that I discovered some tools for myself that really facilitated my interest in consciousness. Two books in particular came toward me, and the first was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that book was just revolutionary for me. It really empowered me to think about this idea of paradigms, that we live in a worldview, we live in a frame that gives us a set of parameters. It's kind of the box, and what are the dimensions of that box that we live in? And what I discovered by reading Kuhn's book is that this box, this model of reality, this paradigm, this worldview, isn't fixed or absolute, but in fact it's dynamic and it's permeable and it's changeable. And for me, it was like, wow, this is fantastic, because it meant that what I was experiencing in all the pain that was around me wasn't something that was necessarily, fast. It wasn't necessarily something that we were stuck with forever. The second book that I read was by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, called Psychic Explorations. And that book was really pivotal for me in the sense that there were a group of serious scientists and scholars who were looking at this mystery of consciousness and really thinking about how reformulating our model of reality and understanding the potentials of our consciousness could help us to facilitate that kind of paradigm shift. And so that was really what motivated me. And, I then was on an odyssey for years, trying to be one of those revolutionaries on the edge. And for me, it took the form of being a scientist, wanting to bring the methods and discernment of Western science to an understanding of our own subjectivity and our own experiences. Eventually, I felt I had a pretty good grasp of the quantitative reductionist model and, began to really explore another rigorous approach, which was anthropology, and trying to understand how anthropologists for over 100 years had really tried to understand the nature of lived experience, but again, using rigor and discernment to do that. So in my career, I've tried to bring together both this kind of quantitative and qualitative approach to understanding consciousness, and in particular, how is it that we can make changes? So consciousness transformation is really, a shift that is long-lasting. It's not just a little insight we have one day, but it really is a fundamental way in which we're reformulating our understanding of who we are and how we fit into the broader world, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to others, what is our place in the world? And again, going back to Maslow's work, how is it that we can really begin to self-actualize even in the face of adversity and challenge? So it is both about us as individuals, but it's also about our role in a collective transformation. And, this is something that we want to play with a little bit today is, what are the tools that we need for ourselves, and how can we begin to translate those out into, our institutions, into our communities, into our workplaces? What are the ways in which we might help to facilitate that kind of transformation? So this slide got a little out of sorts, but worldview is, I think, fundamental to what we understand about consciousness. And consciousness really is about our awareness of our introspection. And our worldview is something that is much less conscious. It's much more hidden. And we know that most of our decisions and our behaviors and our practices are really driven by our unconscious mind. And so I think of worldview as, I guess I'll go back to that, it's just so messy, but worldview is something that is this lens of perception through which we filter our experience of the world. And we know that so much of how we interpret the world is colored and filtered by our biases, by the ways in which we're primed by different kinds of stimuli in our lives. Our education begins to define those parameters. We know that our families, our culture, our religion, our subgroups that we're part of all inform the structures of our worldview, and in ways that we're not even conscious of. And so, oftentimes we think that we have this agency over the world and we're making informed decisions, by golly. And yet we discover that, there are kind of these two systems in our brains, in our minds. System one is the thing that's most habitual. We just make quick reactions based on our intuitions, based on gut feelings that this is what I'm going to do, and I don't even necessarily know why I'm doing it. It's just kind of the autopilot. Whereas there's this kind of system 2 brain, which is more in the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to be reasonable and to kind of calculate what is informing our worldview, what is informing the decisions we make, how is it that we can begin to weigh what are the various factors. And this involves bringing to the extent it's possible, those unconscious perceptions into our conscious awareness so that we can make better decisions, so that we can articulate our behaviors in ways that are more adaptive, more resilient. Okay, so somehow I went in the wrong direction there. Okay. So the work that I did that led to the Living Deeply project, and ultimately, the work that I'm pursuing today around aging, was based on a whole bunch of stuff, and so I gave you my little backstory of how I ended up in the field. But this particular project came with a set of steps. It seems kind of logical and linear when one looks back at their lives. You can construct the narrative so that it's orderly. I'm sure there was a lot less order to it than I'll explain right now, but it helps to tell a story to have a beginning, middle, and end, I guess. So one day I was working at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which, by the way, was founded by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, who'd written that book that really impacted my life. And I had never applied for the job at IONS. I had been working in North Carolina at the Institute of Parapsychology. I went to work at the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas. I ended up in a situation where the in-house research program at IONS was discontinued. They decided to phase it out. So I got laid off, and I'd been there 10 years, done some amazing work with William Broad and Helmut Schmidt. And it was one of those moments where I hadn't finished my dissertation, and I was in a relationship that really wasn't working. And I went to a conference, and a friend of mine said, well, what are you going to do next? And I thought about that, and I was like, well, I hope whatever it is, I can't envision it from this vantage point. And, that was kind of a wise thing to say. I didn't realize it at the time, but, that was an insightful aspiration. And yeah, how do you make that happen? So at the conference, I, gave some presentations, and I hung out a little bit, and it was in Germany. So going to some of the pubs with some of the co-researchers. And when I got back to Texas, I got a phone call from Ed May, who was the head of the DIA-CIA parapsychology program. And we were chatting, and I said, how's your lovely wife? And he said, well, my lovely wife thinks I should hire you. I said, okay, tell your lovely wife I like how she's thinking. And so, in fact, that's what happened. I went to work at the Cognitive Sciences Laboratory in California. And at the same time, I also got a fellowship at Stanford, and it was called the Psychical Research Fellowship. And over 100 years, they had given it out sporadically, and always to people who were skeptics. And, I'm skeptical, but I'm an open-minded skeptic. So here I was living in Northern California. I'd found a place that I didn't anticipate finding. I found these two great jobs, and, was busy doing my thing. While I was at Stanford, I worked on the discourse of controversial science, looking at the nature of the skeptic-proponent debate in parapsychology. And that was really interesting, and I think it's very applicable to kind of what's happening today in terms of the political discourse, that we find people make the same appeals to justify their positions, but they hold them from very different points of view. And that's fascinating when you look at worldview. Well, I was working with Ed and at the Cognitive Sciences Lab and doing some distant mental influence on living systems, which is a topic I had spent a long time working on. And Ed lost his contract, or we lost our contract, the government contract. And so I thought, here I am back in one of those positions where I didn't know what I was going to do, and hoping I couldn't perceive it from that vantage point. And the phone rang, and it was Wink Franklin, who was then the executive director at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he called and asked me if I wanted to come and be their director of research. And I really struggled with that decision, I have to say. I was at Stanford. I was perched on the cusp of a mainstream academic career, and, did I really want to go work in a fringe organization, And then after a couple of weeks, I really recalled that I hadn't gone to graduate school to be a mainstream academic. I had gone because I wanted to be part of the revolution, and I wanted to help cultivate a worldview that was more just and compassionate. And so I ended up at the Institute of Noetic Sciences for a good 25 years. So it was a good decision, and it really served me well. So one day, sitting in my office, Willis Harmon, who was the president at the time, brought a gentleman to me, and his name was Richard Gunther. And his experience, he was a very, very successful businessman, and he had had an epiphany when he stepped out on the deck in Big Sur at the Esalen Institute. And it was a unitive consciousness experience. Suddenly he felt oneness with all, kind of back to Maslow, that kind of self-transcendent experience. And it had a profound impact on his life, on his work, on his family relationships. He became a leading philanthropist. And he wanted to understand what had happened to him. Was it just some freak thing that happened to him? Or was this something that other people had experienced? And if so, were there things we could learn? Going back to that slide about the natural history, how do we bring that kind of natural history perspective to his experience? So we started by, first of all, a literature search. And what we found is, by and large, with some exceptions, people thought of these kind of mystical experiences as pathological, delusional, psychotic. And yet what Richard Gunther was describing wasn't any of those things. It had been very life-enhancing, life-affirming. So we thought, okay, let's find out how many other people have had these kinds of experiences. And as an anthropologist, I put my anthropologist hat on. And we put out a solicitation through the IONS membership. At that point, they had about 50,000 members. And we asked them, have you ever had a kind of experience that shifted your worldview in ways that you feel were life-enhancing? If so, what triggered it, what sustained it, and what were the consequences of it? So we collected these stories, literally these narratives of people's heroes' journeys. And we found that people really described the catalysts in very, very different ways. It could be something as mundane as washing the dishes and looking out the window and seeing that there was this sense of connectedness that they hadn't seen before. One gentleman described his experience being on the battlefield in Vietnam and watching his colleagues being gunned down and feeling this sense of purposeful engagement with the divine. And he was a Christian man, a Muslim prayer came to him, and he began to recite that. And in that moment, to feel this sense that there was something greater than himself. So, what we got from that is almost anything can catalyze these kinds of transformations. They come in all kinds of different ways. We published a paper on that on the Tales of Transformation. Then we started to convene focus groups. We recruited people who were the teachers of transformation, who believed this is something that can be taught and that, people can actually experience these kind of transformations in ways that are pro-social. So we convened 3 of those. We invited in many of the merry minstrels of our field. Angelise Arian sponsored it. She let us conduct these focus groups in her workspace there. And, we had everybody from Michael Harner and George Leonard and Michael Murphy. And it was a great and powerful experience. And one of the things that really came up during that is a lot of tears and a lot of expressions of pain. And it became really obvious that even these masters, even these teachers who were deep into it, had experienced a great deal of suffering that led to their own transformative journey, but also a lot of loneliness and isolation, that, you know, it can often be something where people feel very, very lonely. That's just the best word, that you're on a journey that you don't really have a lot of other people to connect to, and particularly in mainstream culture. And so bringing these people together really helped to solidify a kind of common community, like what we're experiencing here, what coming to school here and engaging in this kind of enterprise allows us, you know, a fraternity of like-minded people who can help to support us. We then did the core of the work that led to the Living Deeply project, and that was interviewing 60 masters from different world traditions. And from the focus groups, we articulated 20 questions that we administered to those masters and invited them to share with us their experiences. And from that, we created what some of these folks call the Sangha. We invited volunteers to come in and help us code the interviews line by line. And we put them in teams, and they would read everything and they would look at themes, and then we brought them together to calibrate the themes and look for meta themes. So it's a qualitative research project. From that, then the chapters emerged, and ultimately a change model that I'm going to share with you a little later. This led us to a more than 2,000 person survey study that allowed us to compare the experiences of those masters, many of whom really had dropped out and lived in a cave for years, with then the average householder. You know, what kinds of transformative experiences did these people have, and how did it compare with what these masters were describing? And that we mentioned a little bit of that, but most of that work is still remaining to be integrated. And, you know, it would be a great dissertation topic for a number of people, actually. We started looking at longitudinal studies. So we worked with a group, for example, the Integrative Transformative Practices group that had been started by Michael Murphy and George Leonard. And they were good enough to let us come in and study them for a year. And we looked at both psychological outcomes and physical outcomes, and found that people who were engaged in this kind of disciplined practice, integral practice, actually showed benefits psychologically, socially, and biologically. They actually reported better health outcomes. Much more could be done with that. It could be done in a more systematic way with a control group, and really, you know, beginning to understand more, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of different aspects. And then we'll come to the end here when we talk about applications. How do we bring this into the world? So here is a little bit of the model that we put together. You know, what are the predictors? What are the outcomes? What moderates these predictors to lead to different kinds of outcomes? You know, on whom and under what kinds of circumstances do people report these experiences? And then ultimately, why and how do changes take place? And what we're finding is that there is an enlarging of people's sense of self, and a sense of a move ultimately from the me, that ego encapsulated self, to that sense of belonging. And again, we'll come to that a little more. And this is, you know, we did both the book, and we did a program where we collected practices because it seemed as though that would be something important. So I'm just going to pause for a second. That's kind of the backstory. And what I'd like to do right now is, as I mentioned, I put together 5 practices that are useful and I think can be incorporated into your work, certainly can be incorporated into your lives. And I would encourage you, if you have a journal or some way to take notes, or to reflect, that we will come to that as part of these practices. So this mindful breathing is something that is core to all of the practices. And it really, brings us to that fundamental agency of life, our breath. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about why it's useful, how it helps us, and then give us an opportunity to ground ourselves here. So we know that our bodies and our brains are, part of an evolutionary process. There are different aspects of our brain that, as I said, often control our behaviors without us even knowing. So the oldest part of our brain, that amygdala part of our brain, is really the fight or flight part. And it was the way in which we survived. Even from the time when we were a different species, it helped as little rodents to know that a snake was not going to be helpful to us. And so the amygdala fight or flight would kick in. And over time, as the human brain developed, we were able to also, begin to formulate other aspects of the brain. The brain became more complicated. And in particular, I point to this prefrontal cortex where, we can begin to self-regulate. We can bring awareness to what is oftentimes this kind of amygdala hijacking. When we get perturbed in the midst of this COVID and we feel that there is this unrelenting anxiety that can be provoked. And in fact, surveys now show that the majority of people report some kind of anxiety. And so what do we do in order to be able to appease that or to regulate that? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. So there is this way in which we have this top-down, bring awareness, self-regulate into those bottom-up kind of emotional responses. And breathing is one of those ways to do it. So let's just, do that right now, if you feel like it, if you're willing. And this is a particular approach. There are many, many ways to practice mindful breathing. And this is just one where we can pause, breathe, and notice what's happening in us. So there are sensations, there are images, there are feelings, and there are thoughts. So if we can just find a comfortable place, and helps to have our feet on the ground, but if there's a better position for you, that's fine too. Whatever works. And so what we're going to do is, really look at this process of whole person breath. And so as we sit, we can inhale to the count of 4. We'll hold for the count of 2 and exhale to the count of 6. So we're just going to do this for a couple of minutes right now, and I'll lead you, and if you feel like it, just observe what's happening for you. So we start with inhaling. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so just take a second. It's so simple, really simple and profound. So I wonder if, as you're bringing your prefrontal cortex to your awareness of your bodily sensations, what came up for you? How did that make you feel? Did it provoke images or sensations? Were you able to feel a little more stable? What was the experience like for you? And then know that you have this within your grasp at any time. And I find for myself sometimes, less so now than at the beginning of the pandemic, but I'd wake up with anxiety in the middle of the night. And it was like, what do I do with these feelings? And, even, heart palpitating and a little bit of panic. And I would just do that breathing exercise. And within minutes, even less, I could feel the calm coming in, and I could feel myself relaxing and able to then go back to sleep. So it's a very useful practice. You can do it anytime. You can do it when you're driving. You can do it when you're walking. You can take time to privilege it. Give yourself a little mindfulness break. And as I said, it's just so simple. I know we all know how to do little mindfulness practices, but I think all of us have a tendency to forget. So, particularly when we're anxious. So the second practice, this is where if you have something to write with or a journal in particular, this is another very easy practice. It's something that it does require some discipline, like any practice. One of the things that we found in the course of doing the Living Deeply project is that there were 5 elements to a transformative practice. One is setting intention, and that is that kind of willful action. I want to feel better. I want to be more productive. I, want to connect better with other people. Those are things that we can bring our intention to. And yet we know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as the expression goes. So intention alone isn't enough. And in fact, it can slip us up sometimes. Then there's this issue of attention. Where are we placing our attention? And this is a fascinating area. We could spend days just talking about that. Most of, if not all of the transformative practices involve some way of shifting our attention. Is the glass half empty or the glass half full? Where are we putting our thoughts? Is it that this is a crisis and, we're never going to get out of this and it's just all hell and damnation? Or are there lessons and insights and gifts that come? We know, again, going back to how the brain works, that we are mostly on autopilot. And so we find that there are ways in which things like inattentional blindness dominate our perceptions of what is possible. So if all we're experiencing is what the news is telling us over and over again about the crisis and the concerns and the challenges, we begin to see that, and we often don't see the other things that lie at the perimeters of our awareness. The now famous experiment of the basketball game, where the 2 teams are playing and you as an observer are instructed to watch how many times the white team takes possession of the ball. It's all happening very fast. And so people get very focused on their attention around the ball. And you can even feed it a little bit. You can say, well, we've noticed gender differences, and one gender does better than the other gender, and people get a little competitive in that. And then in the middle of that, if you haven't seen it, look it up. It's a great video. A gorilla comes out, and he stands right in the middle of the frame, and he beats his chest, and then he exits. And now many people have seen this video, and we have more awareness around inattentional blindness. But particularly in the beginning, when this area of research, the social psychology, was just kind of emerging, we would use it, and the majority of people in an audience would not see the gorilla, would not see it. I have worked quite a bit with Brother David Stendelrast, who's a Benedictine monk, and he is very trained in focused attention in a good way. It's part of his practice. I had to play it for him 3 times and actually run my finger across the video for him to see it. people can become angry. They think you're deceiving them because, well, of course I would have seen that gorilla. So these are the kinds of ways in which our attention can be restricted. And it happens all the time, every day. And it's the majority of the time, actually. So the third piece of a transformative practice is the actual practice itself, the working with the, our neural nets, our neural processing. How do we, just like we go to the gym and build a muscle group, how do we begin to retrain our brains so that that kind of neuroplasticity kicks in? So we can begin to think about how we build new muscle groups in our brains. We lay down new pathways so that what is habitual in one form becomes less so in another. We can build new habits. The fourth thing is guidance. People who we interviewed referenced some form of guidance, whether it was a teacher, a master for them, whether it was a book. In my case, reading those books was profound and transformative. Often, thinking about guidance as coming from outside of us. Taking a class like this is a form of guidance. We're learning new things. But it's also learning to calibrate our inner guidance. And again, going back to, how do we make decisions? If we're just strictly on autopilot, we're not really taking guidance into consideration based on our life's work and experience. So how do we bring more awareness to our own internal guidance system? And then the fifth piece of a transformative practice is really that concept of surrender. That it isn't all about effort, and it isn't all about our volition and changing things. Sometimes it's really about accepting what is so just as it is, and then finding that place of solace in that. So I want to say that, this concept of journaling becomes a very useful tool. A good friend of mine, James Pennybaker, is famous now for having looked at the biological and psychological benefits of journaling. And he collected all kinds of data. This was, particularly at the beginnings of the psychoneuroimmunology field, where, people were looking for ways to enhance our immune systems. And what he found is that just this simple act of writing is a very powerful tool for healing. And, it's not just any writing, it's writing on what is meaningful in our lives. So he argues, and his research shows that if you write for 15 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days, giving yourself uninterrupted time, identifying a single issue you want to address, and then really exploring the emotions and thoughts attached to that issue. And as you're writing, asking yourself, why are you experiencing these emotions? How are you experiencing them? What's coming up for you? What's meaningful about them? That they have measured changes in the immune system, so people have healthier immune systems. Psychologically, people feel more resilient. So it's a very, very simple thing. So I wonder if we might just take a minute. Actually, I'm going to move to this third practice, and we'll do the journaling through this practice. So if you're willing, we won't do 15 minutes today, but you know that you have these tools, and many people journal. It's about bringing that intention and awareness to your journaling. And really, instead of just thinking about journaling in a general way, it is journaling with the intention that you're doing a deep dive on something really meaningful to you. So this practice we'll use for our journaling. And I learned this one from Angeles Arian. She was a wonderful, delightful human being who actually I had the privilege of living down the street from her when I lived in Northern California. And she talked about how the great philosopher Spinoza was asked by the leader to identify the three questions about, or three, actually what he asked is, what gives people meaning? What gives people meaning? And it's kind of funny to think about how he answered. It was only because it was thousands of years ago that he could answer this way. He said, I'm going to think about that for a year and I'll come back. And so he did, and he came back and he identified three questions that he felt people should ask themselves every day to track what gives them heart, meaning, and fire in their lives. So what are these three great questions? And so I'd like you, if you are willing, to take a few minutes now and let's journal on these three great questions. The first is, what made me happy today? Not who made me happy, but what made me happy? And then, where did I experience comfort, peace, and a sense of sanctuary today? And finally, who or what inspired me today? So let's just take 5 minutes and go ahead and address these questions. I'll leave them up on the screen so you have them here. And just focused journaling on these three great questions. Okay, so let's wrap up. Okay. So when we have a little discussion in a few minutes, I'd love to hear from you about what came up for you. This was one of my students at a retreat. And then the blessing way. I love this image. How we can be camouflaged, how we can hide and feel safe. There's solace in that. There's adaptability in that. So this practice, the blessing way, really comes from the idea of how do we bring these practices into everyday life, and how can we recognize in the Living Deeply project, we noted that, you know, it is a move from the me to the we, and it is recognizing that life becomes the practice. So it doesn't require privileging a certain place or time. You know, it can be as simple as honoring the ticket taker at a toll booth, or the person who is selling us food at the grocery. Those things are all opportunities to engage in practice. So these three great actions can be done every day. And so the questions to yourself are, how do you set sacred intention every day? What are the principles? What are the components? Is there a repertoire of prayer or meditation or contemplation or presence? You know, if you have children, you know, are you able to bring your presence? Or in conversation with a loved one, are you bringing your awareness, your empathy, your compassion? How do you set sacred intention every day? And then the second is, how can you give gratitude every day? And gratitude is my favorite practice. And it's certainly something that's easy when things are going well, and the work when they're not. So how do we find that place of gratitude even in the midst of a pandemic? You know, what are the principles we can bring in order to set the blessing way? And then how can we take life-affirming action every day? So what are the ways in which we bring life-affirming action? And Angie talked about how Nelson Mandela asked the people of South Africa to say a little meditation every day. And it was, take care of the children, for they have a long way to go. Take care of the elders, for they have come a long way. And take care of those in the middle, for they are the ones who are doing the work. And so what are the actions that we can take to affirm life each and every day? And these are beautiful practices that offer us an opportunity to, again, journal on these things, reflect on these things. And then finally, this practice of gratitude. As I mentioned, you know, I had a very dear friend who, she became very sick. She had a very nasty brain cancer. And so when I was living in Northern California, I loved to use the Golden Gate Bridge as my little temple. And so it was so easy to feel gratitude going across the bridge. You know, you could look out at the best of nature on one side and the beauty of San Francisco and modern architecture on the other. But she lived in San Francisco and I lived across the bridge. And so I would really try to discipline myself to do gratefulness meditation as I was going across the bridge. And it, was really challenging because I was suffering, she was suffering. It was a time of sorrow, grief, loss. But what I was able to do is find those blessings, even in adversity, to having a friend I cared so much about. What a gift that is. And to know that we had this intimacy of communication, that she was able to share with me what she was going through. And that was a blessing. So all of us have whatever those experiences are that come for us when we are both in perfect situations and when we're challenged. So gratefullliving.org was started by Brother David and Christy Nelson. She's now the director. She said, cultivating, practicing, and sustaining gratefulness as an approach to life is radical because it flies in the face of internal and external forces which want us to believe the big lie, that we need to have more and be more in order to be happy. So grateful living is really appreciating, in any moment. Brother David talked about how being in Austria during the war and bombs going off all around him. And he walked out of a building and he saw a little patch of grass and a little dandelion growing in the grass. And it was through this sense of awe and wonder for the adaptability of that dandelion that he was able to practice, his prayerfulness. And it's a beautiful example, I think. So grateful living invites us to live as if nothing is promised to us, to look around and within ourselves, to appreciate the ordinary as extraordinary. The dandelion, how mundane, most of us would overlook it. It became a focus of awe and wonder. Noticing beauty and nourishing love, whether it's for others or for ourselves, practicing these things that are directed toward ourselves, and gratitude that we have the resilience and the capacity. Be surprised. There's a typo. I'm surprised. Not really. Be surprised. Live in awe and wonder, even for the most mundane things. Recognize your privileges. Open your heart and share your blessings. These are all wonderful ways in which the practice can be something powerful and sustaining. And so when you have time, take this practice of gratitude, and this is another way in which 15 minutes on gratefulness. What are you grateful for? Where does that gratitude emerge in you? And then now there have been, ways in which scientists have attempted to understand, these pro-social, positive psychology kinds of practices and what are the benefits. And what they're finding is that a regular gratitude practice allows people to be more optimistic, experience more joy and pleasure, feel more forgiveness, again, toward self, toward others, have less envy and depression. People exercise more frequently. They have a stronger immune system, fewer physical complaints, better sleep, lower stress hormones, and that every aspect of our cellular memory becomes empowered. And this is a way in which we're taking deeply subjective experiences and bringing this kind of lens of science to them. So actually, I'm going to skip this one for now. I want to wrap up because I want us to have time for conversation. So out of the Living Deeply project, we created this change model. This is a little busy. I'm going to just walk through it very quickly to show kind of the coherence of what I've been describing and how it moves from the me into the we and into a larger sense of our commitment to society. So these transformative experiences, can look like all kinds of things. As I mentioned, almost anything can trigger it. In this diagram, we called it a noetic experience. It's those kind of ineffable qualities that surprise us in life. And we can, whether it's a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, a loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, some major disruption, all of these can really facilitate a kind of transformative experience. And we know that these defense mechanisms work really well, and we can deny them. We can say, we don't want to disrupt the status quo. We're just going to keep moving forward. So that's a kind of pitfall to where this transformative journey begins. And then people can move towards seeking, trying to understand, trying to make sense of. That's where things like the journaling can be very powerful, because they allow us to articulate meaning around these kind of often destabilizing experiences. The pitfall here is that it can lead us to continual seeking, and we never ground it. We never bring it home. Lots of stories about that. And then ultimately, in grounding it, we can find a practice. And practices look like all kinds of different things. Whether it is, a shamanic practice, whether it is a prayerful practice, whether it is walking in nature or listening with authenticity to the stories of others. Any of these things, the journaling is a practice. And as I mentioned, there are these elements of practice. But the pitfalls of these practices are that they can become the end rather than the means for our own awakening. And so, people often feel very righteous. Well, I went to a place on a day, and therefore I'm virtuous, And that kind of misses the point, that it really is about getting out of the pew and off the pillow and into the world, where we can really begin to understand that life is our practice. And then people can become very self-absorbed even in that. It's all about me. It's about my practice. It's about my work. It's about my engagement. And we know that people can really suffer a kind of, fatigue around that. There can be a narcissism, this whole cult of narcissism that develops around the focus on me and mine. But ultimately, the teachers, the masters, the people in the surveys really felt a shift, and this became fundamental, where I moved from it being about my own absorption, my own narcissism, to this sense of generativity and legacy and in the goodness that comes when I am part of something bigger. So that move toward the we, that self-transcendence that Maslow was talking about. And into this living deeply, and this is where I think the surrender piece becomes very powerful. It's a recognition of our own mortality, and that is so, of the aging process and the developmental changes that are going to happen. This is going to be the focus of the certificate program that we're diving into in February. How do we really begin to live deeply, understanding that, there are these qualities that are ineffable, and there is this encapsulated self that is mortal. And how do we begin to live with that? Because there is a pathology that comes when people forget and they resist. So how do we grow with that in a way that allows us to celebrate, that we have this birthright to grow old and to die, and to do that with awareness. And then ultimately, how do we bring this into our communities? And this idea of collective transformation, it's kind of a fractal where, we can begin to see that there are ways that it can be applied to healthcare, it can be applied to education, it can be applied to science. Ultimately, the Willis Harman said, no economic, political, or military power can compare with the power of a change of mind. By deliberately changing their images of reality, people are changing the world. And so I think that's a beautiful insight. It's a beautiful way of thinking about how we are each of us agents of transformation. And we are right now in a tipping point. We have an opportunity to begin to affect change in our own lives, in the lives of others, to share, to give back, and ultimately to express that kind of gratitude that, gives life meaning and purpose. And so I hope that I have offered some tools that can help you in navigating. And I would love to hear from you now. We have, I think, about almost 20 minutes. And so this would be a great time to open this up for people. And I don't know what the process is now. How do we open for, I want to get out of.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, for that wonderful presentation. And I'm sure many of us feel we're back in integral practice, we're back in the module. The material felt very, very resonant with what we're exploring in that module. And quite a few students here who have, were either taking the module right now or took it last year. David's asking whether the slides will become available. I'm sure that could be something that could be arranged possibly.
I think you recorded this, in which case the whole thing is available. So
yes, that is also correct. That's right. So yeah, big questions, and I think many in our community are very much sitting with that experience and exploration of practice, what it means to each of us to be immersed in practice, and then also the challenge of being in the world and living through these kind of tumultuous times which seem to kind of, challenge us on so many levels. And one question I'm sitting with is how we continue that a process of practice and self-search, and then integrate that in what we're doing in the world. When we see what's happening in the world, we can so easily become angry or frustrated. On social media, people, the most kind of best, people who are most integrative, I've seen them on social media kind of losing it, railing against against what they're perceiving as the evils of the world. And these are people who are pursuing integrative practices. And then you think, oh, how does that match up? That's just one example, but we can become so frustrated, right, with the status quo. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that. And then I would also like to invite you all, of course, either place a question in the chat window, and we'll keep an eye on that, or put your hand up. So you can select the hand icon, and we're going to see that, and then we're going to call you out. Okay, so people are doing that. But maybe if you could briefly, Marilyn, speak to that issue of, here we are, we're pursuing practices, and then the world seems to be throwing all kinds of things at us. How do we navigate that gracefully?
There's I don't know who said this, but beware of meeting the person who wrote the book that really transformed you. One of the things I'm grateful for is having gotten to know, some pretty amazing, impressive people well enough to see the warts, and I think that's a gift, because people are human. And we all have these triggers. That amygdala is hardwired. And so, we can work at it. We can support each other. I often like to think about road rage as a spiritual practice. So, somebody cuts you off in the middle of a busy day, and, you want to just be very reactive. But instead, to be able to think, I wonder what's going on for that person. I had it the other day. I was going for a little lab test at the medical center, and this guy jumps out of his car, runs into the place, totally bumps me out of the line, right? And I think, that was like my first reaction. And then I thought, he must have to get somewhere really fast. Mm-hmm. And, so how can I bring that kind of awareness to my own reactivity. So we all have it, and I think we just have to be kind to ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question coming in from Barbara Pigeon. Barbara, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, evening everyone, or I don't know if it's evening for you actually, Marilyn, I'm not sure where you are. But yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk and very much resonated with me. I've been researching breathing in one shape or another for about 15 years. I journal and etc. etc. I'm just wondering if you've had this experience or know anyone else. Like, one thing I've been really like setting intentions, and I'll sit and meditate, I've breathed and done all these things, and I'll set an intention. Often it's about bringing grace in my life. And then I stand up and I completely forget. And then I'll say, right, remember grace, 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 grace. And then I forget. And I just wonder if you ever come across that. And then if there's time, one other question, I was just wondering in what kind of direction your work is going, what your hopes are, what you've achieved, and all that you're doing right now with the Transformation Research Project. That's not too much. But I was just curious if anyone else is having that kind of like setting an intention, but you stand up and go about your daily business.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Nice to meet you. I'm in California, so it's about 1:15 for me in the afternoon. I appreciate all of you doing this in the evenings, and it's, yes. So again, Brother David, he tells a great story about having gone to Africa and really experiencing clean drinking water as a gift, because it was, something you were aware of. It's right there. And so he came home to his place in New York, and he turned on the tap and clean water. And he's like, I'm so grateful. I have this clean water. And then the next day, grateful, but maybe not quite as much. And then, so he got little yellow stick-em notes, and he put them, all over his house to remind him. And then if he started to habituate to the stick-em notes, he'd move them around. So it's, even somebody, who's been practicing for, a long, long time has these same challenges. Yeah. And sometimes we talk about, the little bobble-headed Buddha that sits on your dashboard in your car. Well, is that just kitsch, new agey something? Or is that your reminder? Like when the road rage hits, and pull ourselves down. Mm. And I'd love to hear from anybody else, because there probably are suggestions that people have in terms of what they've done. In terms of my own work, I am really excited about this certificate program we're doing on grateful aging. I feel like there is an opportunity with the demographic shift toward aging, toward a group of people who want to help that shift. And so the program is really aimed toward, caregivers, nurses, psychologists, coaches, anybody who is interested in gaining some new skills in order to begin to help, reduce the suffering and enhance the well-being of our aging population. So that's probably the most exciting thing right now for me is doing that. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. Thanks, Marilyn.
Thank you, Barbara. And if there are other questions, please, now is your opportunity.
Or anything that came up in terms of the great questions, what gives you fire? Where is your fire? Those are things I'd love to hear.
Yeah. One piece, whilst people are typing and thinking, one piece I'm still sitting with is this question of the individual and the collective, and whether we will affect change in the world simply by following those steps, working on ourselves, and of course thereby also being of service in the world. Or is there something that we need to do on a collective level, kind of getting better at understanding collective dynamics, human social fields, the organizational systems, all that piece. Now, how do you see those two meeting and coming together?
Well, I think we're doing it right here and right now. And I think that, LF Trust and the kinds of teachers and the kinds of students that are drawn to it. I really do believe in these kind of learning communities, and that we are here to support one another in the exploration and remind each other. So, that's a big part of the journey, and Barbara pointed it out. It's like we forget, and so to the extent we can continually learn and grow and cultivate a growth mindset, that's really key, I think. And I see somebody posted about being, Darren, thank you for saying about having met teachers and finding disappointment. I think that's a really important issue. Like, our own disappointment is something we have to look at and we have to own. Like, how did I react to that? That's up to me to determine. But it's also true that, we project onto people that they know more. They are, they know and I don't. And that's just a common way in which we experience life. And as I said, I know I won't name names, but I could. And I could name some very famous names of people who, really showed their humanity in a way that wasn't as, functional as we might like. And so it's, how do we find the source within us to forgive, to accept, to acknowledge, to witness? Those are all things that we have within us. And so, being part of a group like this is just really great. And the more we can do these kinds of things, the more we can share with one another. Like the Aging Project, how beautiful it is to have a person who's, one of my great teachers. She's 95 years old now. And she's just, filled with audacity. And to be inspired by her audacity, and then know that there are a lot of people who aren't as resilient as she is. And so how can we learn from those masters and then begin to share that?
Yay, thank you. And I think there's something there for all the kind of social justice warriors who are, trying to affect change. There's something for them there as well, right? To learn that we can't bring change through anger or through, stoking that fire and producing more of the same dynamic. So there's some need for almost bringing an energy that is kind of grounding and calming and soothing. May that be on social media or in the groups that we're facilitating when we're meeting people who are disagreeing with us. I mean, here we're in a circle where we're all very resonant with each other, and it's very affirming. But when we go out into the world, often we can find ourselves in settings where, work settings, life settings, where people don't agree with us necessarily, right? And that's always...
I think there are toxic relationships. I'm not trying to gloss over, where the difficulties lie. And I think the best thing we can do is provide as much perspective taking. I know I moved, so here's my politics, but I'm a blue person and I live in a very red county and I live in a very blue state in a country that is seriously divided. Mm-hmm. And so, my next door neighbors put up a big flag representing a position I don't take. And at first it really bothered me. And then I realized, they feel probably that they're the minority. And they feel this need to champion a cause they believe in. And they're very kind people. They're not bad people. And, we talk about our garden. And, so finding those places where there is common ground is a great way to engage people whose worldviews are fundamentally different. Knowing that we can take time outs, because that amygdala hijacking happens for everyone. And no matter how old we are, we can take a time out. And we can do that breathing, and the breathing really helps. And then if we choose to and we're motivated, we can come back for, further engagement with that person. I have a student who is writing about how to have difficult conversations at the dinner table. And so in particular, like holidays, and you have people coming together who, often don't see each other for a year at a time, and they're sitting there and people get provoked. And, you know, so she's really, I thought it was a great topic, and I'm encouraging her to start a blog because, you know, there's a lot of insights for all of us in how do we stay balanced in the middle of those difficult conversations, particularly with people we love and want to stay engaged with.
Right, here. Hanukkah and Christmas are just around the corner, so that's certainly coming up for many
people. We may not have as much of a risk this Christmas.
Yeah,
because
right.
That's another thing. You know?
Yeah, quite right. I can see that Katsi has her hand up. Katsi Shamans, come on in and ask your question or comment.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Marilyn, for the lecture. And I'm a big fan of your book. I joke around with my students all the time that I always pick it up and I can give a Dharma talk on it in any of my yoga classes. I've basically not torn it to shreds, but highlighted and really dove deeply into it. So thank you for this. You mentioned a bit about surrendering, and also in the main question as to what gives you fire, what is the meaning of the heart, and to live from purpose. And I find that quite often when I put my attention to these elements of the fire, that the fire can get out of control, or I'm living through too much from the heart, that my passion is what drives me too far forward, and etc. And I was playing with this a lot today, actually, like this balancing out, like just allowing yourself to completely surrender and to manage these elements. So I was wondering if you had advice as to how to find a happy medium between the two, and to like letting go of control when we might feel so like living wholeheartedly from this fire and heart place.
Really great question. I wish I had a perfect answer. I don't, but it is clearly one of the pitfalls. You know, you get the caregiver fatigue, for example, where people are forgetting about the me in service to the we. So it has to be a balance between how much I am generous to the world and how much I take time to soak in the bathtub. I mean, that's one of my practices, and a wonderful bubble bath is like my greatest solution to life's challenges, and I'm very grateful I have one. You know, so it's how do we nourish ourselves, because you can't really live fully if you're divided. So we can be a generous spirit, but in order to be authentic in that, we have to be generous with ourselves as well. So that's what I would say is, you know, find the balance, find the times when you pull back from that so that you can nourish yourself. And all those qualities that we talk about in terms of pro-social behaviors, you know, forgiveness, compassion, generosity, all have to also be applied to ourselves. And, you know, and so I think that that's where something like the journaling practices or the breathing practices are really important. And friendships. You know, we know that friendships have one of the most therapeutic benefits of anything. Dean Ornish, in one of my books, I interviewed him, and he talks about how, you know, it is the most giving love, having love, experiencing love is the best therapeutic remedy of anything. And that's love for oneself as well as for others. You know, so how do we find that place? So thank you. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book. And yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to reading more.
Thank you, Katsi, and thank you very much, Marilyn. We're coming up to time, people. We're going to have to wrap up, but I just want to say it's been a really, really rich session with so many wonderful examples of practice and just so much to take away. So a big thank you to you, Marilyn, for this wonderful session.
Thanks for the posts on the chat. There's a lot of really good insights there, and I'm grateful for that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for those who've posted there as well. And Nick, if we could share that final slide, thank you. So this is just to give the Grateful Aging program a little plug, and it's been mentioned already, but if you want to find out more, please feel free to have a look at our website. You'll find it there under Professional Certificate Programs. And again, thank you, Marilyn, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye, and stay well, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.